everybody, and welcome to Celeste. Now this is a pretty special episode of Malin for Gold because as I'm uploading this, it is the Transgender Day of Visibility. And, you know, the day itself, March 31st, doesn't hold a lot of meaning to me, but I couldn't think of a better time to make this kind of video. And this kind of video is just one where I guess I wanted to talk about my experience of being trans and just kind of how that journey has been for me, because it's a pretty important part of my life and identity, and you know, it kind of shapes a lot of the way that I have grown up and the friends I've made and the friends I've lost. And I think that is kind of a common thread for a lot of trans people is that it's not always easy and there are ups and downs, but that it was also in a lot of ways the best thing that could have ever happened to me. And so why am I picking Celeste to be the video? Well, if you've played Celeste, or you've even had like an inkling of an idea about Celeste, or you've talked to any person who has recommended you Celeste, then you probably already know the answer to that question, because it eternally comes up in this kind of conversation. But basically, it's a game about a trans person made by a trans woman. It's kind of just that's the whole idea. And also it's a fantastic game that should, if you haven't played, you definitely should. If you're a fan of 2D platformers, then you probably have played it, or you've definitely been hounded by someone at some point to play it, because like I say, Celeste is really, really popular, and you know, I'm only human. It is a really good game, and yeah, that's what we'll be playing today. To start off with, it's like, how do you even come to the conclusion, right? How do you say, okay, I'm trans, what's next? And that was the longest part of the journey for me. It took 15 years. And you know, I'm not 30 yet, so that is the majority of my life. And the story there is that, as I look back now, there are signs, and there are ways I probably could have said, you know, this is a sign of transness. Like, as an older person now who kind of understands that and what that means, that would have been my conclusion on the matter. But you know, growing up, I did not know a lot about what being trans meant, and I didn't really have a lot of perspective on that either. I knew I knew what being trans was, in that, like, you know, these are people who identify as a gender different to the one that they were born as. That was my idea of what being trans meant as a kid, and that is the mostly solid definition of what being a trans person is. But I always had this perception from media and from even the people that I knew, because I did know trans people, but I always had this perception, and part of this is, you know, not asking questions, but also the fact that it wasn't taught at all. There's very little education about it in the UK, and I think there are like ways in which that is improving. I do remember distinctly as a child having conversations about, you know, queer people and queer identity, but it was very focused on like sexuality, and very little in the way of gender was discussed, and it certainly didn't help me get any closer to figuring it out. And part of me feels like If I had been told more about the experience, then maybe I would have figured it out sooner. But yeah, my basic idea was that trans people knew they were trans. You see so many, particularly like being a young person and having a trans friend. It's like I see so many young trans people who already have it all figured out. Jazz Jennings was a little kid and she already knew that she was trans. So, you know, I had these feelings that I would describe today as being trans feelings and trans experience, but I didn't know. I didn't realize that it was an option. I didn't realize that, you know, you're not born having figured it out. I thought that if I haven't figured it out by this point, then that can't possibly be me. And as it turns out, that's wrong. That is just straight up not how it works. And I think, you know, breaking down that barrier is what ultimately led me to figuring it out. I remember distinctly times as a kid where I asked people to call me by a female name, and it wasn't the name I go by today. And I remember distinctly the feeling of, like, you know, these sort of more masculine you know, traits and hobbies, they weren't for me. Puberty was so difficult as a young child, figuring it all out and not really understanding gender. I didn't understand why it was so difficult. You know, growing up an autistic person, I already had this weird sense of identity where I had these, you know, authority figures and doctors and things telling me, oh, you're autistic and this means this and this and this, and it means you behave this way, and you have all these, to this point, old-fashioned ideas of what being autistic meant, and I was trying to fit myself into that, and in some ways I did and in some ways I didn't. So already with regards to identity, like, it wasn't always the most clear thing. And, you know, trying to fit my own experience with gender into that whole mix wasn't the easiest thing. And so there's that other aspect of it where, like, okay, that was also like a barrier to figuring it all out, is that there were other aspects of my identity that I were still getting a clearer picture of, right? You know, being autistic means that I'm resistant to change. That's not true for all autistic people, and it's less true for me now than it was when I was younger. But, like, you know, humans in general are resistant to change. I think it was just amplified. I really didn't like being put outside of my comfort zone, and now today as an adult, I'm more willing to put myself in those scenarios. So when puberty came around, and I was not particularly enjoying myself, there were aspects of that where it's like, well, how much of this is because of my dislike of change and my resistance to change? It didn't immediately spring forth as being a gender thing. And why would I have any reason to believe it's a gender thing when, for all that I know, trans people just know they are trans from the minute they're born? Because I've seen so many trans people on media and in stories that come out as young children. So again, couldn't be me. So we've set the stage, right? It's me, I'm young, I'm a teenager, and I haven't really figured the gender thing out. I have a trans friend, but I haven't really talked about trans stuff to because, you know, I wasn't really concerned with it. It didn't seem to be particularly important to me, and he had never brought it up. It wasn't until later on that one of my other friends had started talking to me about gender stuff that I realized, oh, well, if he doesn't have it figured out now, then maybe that could also apply to me. But he still seemed to know a lot more about the subject than I had, so it didn't immediately click that, oh, maybe I could be trans too, but it definitely got me thinking about it. And as soon as I realized that everything that I had been experiencing up until that point could fit into this easy box of transness, it immediately started becoming more real. And I immediately started becoming a lot less comfortable with my old name and my sort of role in society. Being perceived as male made me a lot less comfortable. And it was all because I had finally taken that step and said, okay, I think I might be trans now. And so, between me and my friends, I started going by Lily. And I started using she, her pronouns. And it felt normal and it felt comfortable. And that's kind of the moment that I realised that this is gonna be a thing. And then I came out to my parents, and I was never really worried about their reaction because my parents have always been really supportive. But I also wasn't entirely comfortable with it because I had never really shared that kind of stuff with my parents before. We didn't have these reflective, emotional, introspective conversations because I was a pretty, like, you know, introverted kid. I spent a lot of time playing Minecraft on my computer, and I spent a lot of time, you know, just minding my business. And when I was sad, I kept it to myself, or sometimes expressed it very loudly. And when I was happy, I equally kept it to myself. So, you know, coming out to my parents was difficult. And it took me a couple days of building up the courage. And then once I finally managed to do it, it was like, okay, well, what's next? And I was like, I need to come out at school. It just has to happen. It was miserable going into school every day and having people refer to me by this name that didn't feel like me and was increasingly not feeling like me. And so what was the process like for that? How did that go? And, well, the answer to that question is that it went slowly. I didn't really know what to do, but I knew that I had to talk to somebody in the school about it. I didn't want to just come into school one day and declare that you're going to call me Lily now. I wanted to make sure that all of my teachers were on the same page, and if I got it in writing, then it meant that none of my teachers could be pricks about it, which some of them still found ways to do, but we'll talk about that in a second. And so I talked to my guidance teacher and I said, listen, I'm transgender, I've come out to my parents, I want to come out at the school. And he was like, oh, okay, give me a second, I don't know what to do here. And so he was reading up, apparently, on the internet about how to handle the situation because, you know, I guess I was the first person to come to him specifically about it. I was not the first person to come out as trans in my school, but he was clearly not prepared to deal with that. And I took him a little off guard by saying, hey, I'm trans, I want to come out of school now. And so it took a couple days, but he was like, all right, I can change this on the system, and then tomorrow you can be Lily. And I was like, that's great, I'm gonna do that. And so I got the new uniform and I came in and I introduced myself to everyone. And this should have been the most difficult part. This should have been the most scary day of my life. Coming into school with a brand new identity and having to deal with everything that entails, having to deal with the people who are resistant to it, and having to deal with, you know, reintroducing myself to everybody that I've known for years at this point. You know, this is 4th year high school. People who I have known since primary, people who I met, you know, 3 years ago at this point in 1st year of high school, and it was easy. And it should have been that difficult, but it wasn't, and it was easy, and I was elated to not have to hide in that box anymore. I remember coming into school and, you know, wearing my new uniform. I talked to one of my friends and I was like, hi, I'm Lily now. This is a bit of a surprise. And she was like, is this a joke? Like, are you for real? Because, you know, I'm pretty funny. I make jokes. And I was like, no, this is for real. Like, you should probably take me seriously on this one. And she was like, okay, that's great. And it didn't always go that well for everybody that I spoke to. Some people were more resistant than others. I remember my first class that day was Nat 5 Physics. It was a fantastic class, actually. I really liked my teacher for physics, and I really enjoyed physics because, you know, physics in high school is always one step behind maths. So if you're good enough at maths, then physics is kind of breezy. It's kind of like applied maths, but, you know, it's all maths that you learned like a couple months ago in your maths class. So it's easy, right? And Nat 5 maths in particular is a lot of problem solving kind of thing where it's like, yeah, the most complicated thing you're doing is like squaring numbers. And so, you know, it was a fun class. It was a relaxed class for me. And I remember coming in and I was the first person to get to my class that day. And as people poured in, I reintroduced myself one at a time. And there was this guy in my class who was particularly mean. I had never had problems with him before, but, you know, people did get bullied by this guy. He was a bully. Not to me specifically, but just kind of in general. And I was pretty worried when he walked into the classroom because, you know, I already stood out being an autistic person. So, you know, being sort of like visibly trans now and having to like reintroduce myself to all of these people, I was not prepared for whatever it was that he was going to have to say about this. And he was okay with it. I came out as trans and he was like, oh, okay. And then for the rest of the year, he was the first person to correct anyone when they had mistaken my pronouns or name. And that was really weird to me. It was really weird that this guy, kind of the person I was most worried about walking into this physics class, was the most supportive person, arguably, that I had in that class. And then I got to English, and English was a double period, and that meant it was an hour and 40 minutes long, and it didn't go swimmingly. The first thing that happened when I walked into the classroom was this guy came up to me and said, you know, I'm never going to call you Lily, and I'm always going to call you by your old name. And I slapped him because, you know, he deserved it. And then he never put up a fuss again. But it was really interesting because when my teacher got to the classroom, she said, who slapped him? Why did that happen? And I said, it was me. And all she had to say on that matter was that I probably had a good reason to do it. And I didn't even get in trouble. I was so prepared to fight that, but it just never came to anything. And I did have to fight, like, my teachers sometimes on things because, you know, I was not the most well-behaved student, but I always had good intentions, right? But somehow, by God's grace, that specific day went easy for me. And then there's the bad part of my English class, which is that for 15, probably less, it was probably only a couple minutes, but for what felt like hours, my teacher grilled me and asked me questions. What does this mean? Why are you trans now? Why is this your name? Why did you pick this? Why won't you go by this anymore? And it was devastating because we hadn't even started the class. It's not like people were getting on with their work and she was talking to me one-on-one, which, by the way, still would have been a pretty inappropriate, like, fucking interrogation session to give to your trans pupil, but I would have been more okay with it than what actually happened, which was that in front of the entire class I'm being grilled on my identity, and if I get one question wrong I might shape the way that everybody looks at me for the rest of the year. Right? Like, that's hard. But I think I managed to get through everything okay, and there were good few answers in there that were like not really any of your business, but you know, got through it okay. And you know, that was only the first half of my day, but it kind of describes how the rest of the day went. there were a lot of people that I needed to reintroduce myself to, but it was generally well received, and that's all I could have hoped for. And there were growing pains, and there were people who didn't get it right for a long time, but eventually did, and there were people who never got it right, and who I obviously don't speak to anymore. I don't really speak to a lot of people from high school anymore. In fact, it's really only one person from high school that I still speak to. But yeah, some people were better about it than others. The main group of people who were bad about it were the younger years. Nobody in my year gave me too much trouble after the initial, like, coming out, where some people were quite resistant to it. But the younger years were brutal. I mean, very rude, very mean, a bit too big for their britches kind of deal, right? Like, why are you being transphobic to me? You're literally like 12. But there were people like that, and I just had to hold it and be like, okay, little guy, you're fucking being transphobic to me. It's weird, but I can't really do too much to mend that, I guess. And then it was fine for a while. I kind of lived inside this box that was high school, and because my identity was clear to everybody in the high school, I never really ran into major trouble with that. But then I got out of high school and I was like, oh, my name's still not legally changed, I should probably do that. And it was 2020 and there was COVID and stuff, so it was a good day. It was a good time to pick. It was a good time to pick. Oh yeah, I'm gonna change my name now. Particularly when you need witnesses, signatures when you're doing that, and you know, COVID, so you can't meet up with anyone. But I figured out a way, and I sent off all the paperwork to all the people who needed to know, and that was that. So, as I've said, there were ups and downs to my early transition, and it's been 5 years now since I came out, and genuinely the best decision that I have ever made. And I love the person that I have grown into being. Now, I'm not really sure how to end this video other than by saying thank you all for listening to what I had to say, and I will see you in the next Melon Keeper Gold video.